So the idea of the living room was to produce an experience where the viewer realized that our environment is alive. So this performance is called living room. It's a room, of course, in which you are living. At the same time, we are very interested to look at the way the room is actually living by itself. How does it become a subject? We are used to be the subject of the space, but in this case, we want the room to act upon the performer.
We have this feeling that we are controlling our environment, but it's really not like that. We are even not aware how often we are controlled with our environment and how our spaces, our objects that we are using are determining our action. So it's not only that we determine objects in accordance to our actions or design them, we try to design objects and spaces which would accommodate in the best way our urges, our needs and our desires, but we are not aware how much actually are we determined from the spaces we are inhabiting and from the objects we are using, because all these objects and spaces, they have some intrinsic value in themselves, which we try to ignore or we are not aware of. We were about to design this floor, and the floor has as architecture element, it has this potential, because in this ambiguity between this very complex section and very calm and neutral surface. So it can hide a lot of mysteries, and at the same time is offering complete flexibility for every single scenario and action to take place. And that's why for me, this element of the floor was interesting in particular when talking about living room and when defining a living room. Our task is to design spaces in the way that they also allow this unpredictable things to function as well.
Yes, I had this idea actually 4 years ago, a bit less than 4 years ago, and of course when you make a performance it takes time and you have to create the conditions to make the performance. So in the meantime a lot of things happened, and we had particularly the lockdown. I also experienced very big change in my life. So the living room that was planned, which was a lot about this environment that is acting upon us and that is living, also took another light upon light, which is the perspective of the lockdown, of being locked in our interiors, of spending ages into the small rooms. My work has always been related to architecture and to space, and the space was always defining in many ways the performance and the dramaturgy, the choreography. But here I wanted to really make it specific, and also that the research become about thinking the space in terms of architecture. We spent quite some time searching what actually are the implications of building a room, and we came to this somehow minimal idea that the room could be just in a way signified by the floor, and the floor is actually containing all the different forces which are possible, like turning, sliding, going up and down, going back and forth, so all the different acts that you can think. So we did not want to motorize object, but actually that the force of the room act upon the things.
And it was a big deal of the work was exactly this: how do you encounter space as an entity that doesn't speak, but it's a very strong and important presence. And so when I worked in the Healers on that idea, it gave me already some informations or some strategies that I could maybe also see to share here with Clément and to support him in this way, so that he can also work with certain states of being rather than acting or doing actively things, but more to operate in the system of states, body states, which would support him in the dialogue with the mechanism, with the objects, with the living room. Through public and private, we work now since some 13 years, 14 years together, and it is somehow always in a dialogue with each other, and we don't create together works, always one is a lead. So in this living room work, Clément is a lead, and he also develops his own signature, as I do in my own work, and I found this very interesting that we are transparent with each other processes, not always totally, but we can give each other insights about how ideas ripe, how they develop, and how they have form.
In a way, this is a continuation of previous work that Clément did, working with objects, working with the relation between human and non-human things. But at the same time, it's also a change, because now Clémentine is really focusing much more on the questions of environment and the relation with the environment. Also this question of how can we relate to this environment that is closing in on us, that is changing, and that gives us actually less living room in a way. So this is also something I think we see in the piece. It's a smaller space, a living room in which we have to kind of figure out how to live with the things that surround us, and things that surround us that are not only at our service, but that are also having their own ideas, having their own minds. So how to start working in this, or start living basically in this environment. I think in that sense it's interesting that living room plays, of course, with this duality. On the one hand, it talks about this space where we live, where we feel at home, where we are at ease. It's our space, it's our private space. But of course, living room also relates to this idea of a living organism, a thing that has a mind of its own, that has a functioning of its own. So it's always this question in the piece are we living in the room, or are we part of that living organism, which is the living room?
In this project, as a basically point of departure, for me it was really important to sort of dial it back a bit, coming from Anon, where we had all these like elaborate mechanisms, to somehow find a way to get back to what I personally would also perceive as like the origins of Clément's work, and to find something that, I don't know, you might refer to like a resilient object, that actually poses a challenge as opposed to sort of a commodity for him, and to simplify things a lot. Basically, what like a really meaningful point in the design process to me was to understand basically the threshold between showing a mechanism and showing something that could maybe be described as a current or a condition.
Clément and me worked together for a long time, 10 years or more. And so the role of the light designer slowly shifted already starting from the last piece on into being like light and mechanism designer, or rather like part of a designer group together with Jonas. And this time actually the process was even more special, because in my memory we spent weeks and months like discussing the living room and the possible living rooms. Like we were sitting here, Morana, Clément, Jonas and me, and projecting like how this room like could work in dimensions and how it could magically move. Light was always an actor, in a way. I saw it much more, instead of like seeing it as decorative or necessarily like guiding a gaze. It was always an actor as much as you, as movement, as sound. So in a way it's like kind of a very equal relationship. And now in this piece, like we got another actor. And the other actors are the mechanisms. And I think personally, like doing lights, I'm much more interested in seeing lights as one more actor communicating with the other actors than to serve the performance. That's maybe the thing. I want the light to communicate with the other elements.
For the dramaturgy of the piece, we really started from very simple everyday actions, things you would do in your living room, but at the same time, because this living room is a living organism, these actions constantly have to be adapted, so the main character, the performer, constantly has to change his relation to the environment, constantly has to adapt. In this piece we also were thinking a lot about questions of interiority, or the idea of being inside the living room, but also inside of your mind. So often it's in this piece it's not very clear if you are inside the performer's living room, or if you are inside this person's mind, and if you are following certain train of thoughts. So if these actions are not only actions that are done in the room, but also in somebody's mind, that are dreams, impressions.
The sound kind of works in a way that, as if the room itself had collected sound material itself, and like if the walls could speak in a house or in a living room, what would they say, what would they resonate? And that's how I was kind of imagining it. So, and then I also asked Clément to give me some of his material that might have had on his phone, and some of it was really amazing things of his father singing, playing piano, his daughters, him playing guitar with his family. And so I've used all of these things and put them together to make it as if these things are kind of resonances of memories that exist within the space. So there's another important aspect of the piece where we have made songs, and these songs came from previous development or process with the Clémentine collective or group process, where a group of artists came together and generated text material, and that text material was given to me, and then I turned it into songs, and some of that material has entered into the piece. So it's like this text that has related to the Corona time and the lockdown period. So it's this generated text which has to do with the period that we have gone through, and this isolation and dependency and interdependency.
Ist eigentlich gar nicht mehr unsere architektonische Praxis, eigentlich einen Living Room zu entwerfen. Umso mehr hat uns das natürlich interessiert, weil so wie Clément auf uns zukam, ja gerade es um diese Auflösung geht und darum, diesen Begriff auch mit neuem Leben zu erfüllen. Es ist ein ganz schmaler Grat. Also es ist wirklich ein ganz, ganz schmaler Grat zwischen Openness und Determinierung. Ich glaube, das ist auch dieses Resist, ein bisschen Widerstand gehört auch dazu. Also dass man sich mit Räumen irgendwie, dass man die spürt, oder dass man da so ein bisschen auch widerständig ist. Ich würde jetzt nicht sofort sagen, Determinierung ist schlecht, Openness ist gut. Nee, das ist, irgendwo gibt es da in der Mitte etwas.
Clémentine M. Songe is a persona I have encountered in myself since many, many years. But only since a few years I really started to develop them. And I realized that it's very meaningful for me to make this process of transformation in this time of radical transformation. It is nowadays, I feel, very difficult to just go on. There is a need for reimagining ourselves completely, reimagining our institutions, and starting, I guess, at the core of our beings.